Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And welcome to the 2016 Richard D. Cohen Lectures in African and African American Art. My name is Cheryl Finley, and it is my great honor to introduce my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Richard J. Powell, Dean of Humanities and the John Spencer Bassett Professor of Art and Art History at Duke University. In a celebrated career that has spanned more than 30 years, Dr. Powell has distinguished himself as an artist and illustrator, an art historian and critic, and a curator and public historian. One of his finest qualities is that of a collaborator, one who builds community, nurtures friendships, and interweaves scholarly and artistic talent to produce critically acclaimed exhibitions, scholarly texts, and riveting documentaries. These productions of art history have had a lasting impact that have shaped and reshaped the field of African American art, and in so doing, redefined the contours of American and African art. Rick's passion for the fine arts began when he was an undergraduate at Morehouse College, where he majored in art. From there, he went on to study printmaking in the Fine Arts Department at Howard University in Washington, D.C., renowned for such luminaries in the field of African American art as Harlem Renaissance-era printmaker James Lassane Wells, James A. Porter, the author of the pioneering survey text Negro Art, published in 1940, and painter Lois Mailou Jones, a native of Boston. Also the painter and educator David Driscoll and painter Jeff Donaldson, one of the founding members of the artist collective Afro-Cobra, were there. The example of these legendary artists, who were also educators, scholars, and curators, would surely influence Powell's career path and future aspirations. After earning an MFA in printmaking from Howard in 1977, he moved to New York to begin a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship in Museum Education at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which piqued his interest in art criticism and organizing exhibitions. Powell's curatorial debut came in 1979 at the Studio Museum in Harlem with Impressions, Expressions, Black American Graphics, one of the pioneering surveys of African American printmaking. Shortly thereafter, Powell entered Yale University, where he received the MA in African American Studies in 1982 and the PhD in History of Art in 1988. While at Yale, he worked with the innovative art historians Robert Farris Thompson, notable for his influential text, Flash of the Spirit, about the continuities of art, performance, and culture across the Black Atlantic between Africa and the Americas, and Sylvia Arden Boone, the first Black woman tenured at Yale, and author of Radiance of the Waters, Ideals of Feminine Beauty in Mende Art. Powell wrote his dissertation on the artist William H. Johnson, and after a year in Scandinavia conducting dissertation research on a Fulbright scholarship, he moved to Washington, D.C. to complete his dissertation under the auspices of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which is the largest repository of Johnson's work. His PhD dissertation, William H. Johnson, the expressionist and artist of the blues aesthetic, became the book and major touring exhibition Homecoming, The Art of William H. Johnson, in 1991. And I want to point out that Professor Powell has been really influential in not only the number of exhibitions and scholarly texts that he's written, but also in coining certain kinds of words in the history of art, like the blues aesthetic, or phrases, if you will. And he'll be talking about the sartorial and the satirical as well later on this week. While there in Washington, Powell became the director of programs for the alternative space Washington Project for the Arts. And always ahead of the curve, he was responsible for producing a number of noteworthy exhibitions and performances that defied the conservatism of the mainstream art world in exhibition spaces on the National Mall. These included a retrospective of one of his teachers, the DC-based printmaker James Lassane Wells, and shows that defined the 1980s culture wars, including installations by conceptual artist David Hammonds and performances by poet and gay rights activist Essex Hemphill. Also, a performance by the dancer Catherine Dunham was organized by Professor Powell at the Washington Project for the Arts. And I, as a native Washingtonian, remember going to the WPA to see these shows and how they shaped my own future path as an art historian. It's important to note that Rick joined the faculty of the Department of Art History, and Visual Studies at Duke University in 1989, and he has created a productive and synergistic work environment there where he's mentored generations of artists and art historians and helped to build the art history curatorial powerhouse there using the National Museum of Art and the National Humanities Center as a base. And I think that I would be remiss if I did not mention the number of scholarly texts and also exhibitions that he's most noted for. And I'm just going to run down a list here for you just to give you a sense of his breadth as a curator and a scholar, and also to kind of have you think back in your own minds how many of these exhibitions you've actually seen, how many of the texts you have in your own libraries. Notably, I would like to note or mention the blues aesthetic, Black Culture and Modernism. This is an exhibition that was on view in 1989 and around the same time that he joined Duke University. Rhapsodies in Black, Art of the Harlem Renaissance in 1997. To Conserve a Legacy, American Art at Historically Black Colleges and Universities in 1999. And this is a really important exhibition that was not only one that showcased the work of art collections at places like Hampton and Howard and others, but also tried to show that these collections not only included the works of African American artists, but also American artists. And I think in doing so, in collaboration with Jacques Reynolds, with this exhibition, To Conserve a Legacy, they actually got funding to conserve many of the works that were in these collections that had been left to the side and not cared for over a number of years. So this was an important pioneering exhibition that was on view at the Studio Museum in Harlem and also toured around the United States. Another important exhibition, Back to Black, Art, Cinema, and the Radical Imaginary in 2005, was co-curated with David A. Bailey and Patrine Archer-Straw, and that's a work that began at the White Cube in the UK, and one I think that shows Professor Powell's breadth in terms of thinking about how we can look at this period during the Black Arts movement that is not something that just happens in the United States, but it's an international movement that involves the Caribbean, and it also involves the UK as well. And most recently, his work, Archibald Motley, Jazz Age Modernists, was on view last at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And it's important to say, too, that a lot of his exhibitions have traveled nationally. Some of them have also traveled internationally. And that these works are works that, as I said, are teaching exhibitions that really help us understand and give a sense of the work of African American artists and African American art as a progression. So as an educator, Rick, I think, is one of the most generous scholars and mentors. He's tireless at his work. He's contributed his expertise to the field and to service by being on the boards of a number of different institutions and also serving as editor, for example, not too long ago, editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin, which is the world's leading English language journal in art history published by the College Art Association. He's also served on the boards of the International Review of African American Art, the Romare Bearden Foundation, and he's also on the Scholarly Advisory Committee of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is soon to open on the Mall in Washington, D.C., in a building designed by the noted British Ghanaian architect David Adjaye. Rick's service to the field has earned him several deserved accolades, including the Lawrence A. Fleischman Award for Scholarly Excellence in the field of American art history from the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art, among many, many others. And just this past February, as an example, Rick was honored by the College Art Association's annual conference in Washington, D.C., as the year's most distinguished scholar. And on that panel, there were scholars such as Kobina Mercer of Yale, Gwen Everett of Howard, Kelly Jones, most recently a Du Bois Fellow here, and of Columbia University, our own Suzanne Blier as well. But Rick presented on his own panel, and in his own presentation, he presented what I thought was both a riveting, funny, and probing paper titled, "I Hate the Banjo Lesson." And it was a great performance. It was one that I think had many people, there were some people sitting next to me who actually thought I won't let the cat out of the bag, but they believed it all. And this is a paper that probed, as he said, the contours of Black intellectual freedom. And with that, he introduced one of his next projects, which is a speculative fiction that liberates African American art history from existing evidence. And I think he also would like to look at this project as another form of satire, and I think he's going to talk a little bit about that today. I just want to say a few things as an educator myself, and I think most of us in this room are educators, but I also teach African American art history, and I think it's impossible to teach African American art history without the groundbreaking contributions of Richard J. Powell. His writings and exhibitions on 19th and 20th century printmakers and painters in the United States and abroad, his work on the Harlem Renaissance era artists, his studies of the Black arts movement from an international perspective, including the Caribbean and the UK, his work on photography and film are all necessary tools of any survey course. Notably, his books, Black Art, A Cultural History, published in 1997 and later republished and revised in 2002, is a must-use companion on African and African diaspora art and culture. Cutting a Figure, Fashioning Black Portraiture, published in 2008, really redefined the way that we look at Black fashion, posing, the dandy, and all things sartorial. And I want to just finally close. I was going to read a quote, but I feel like I've probably gone over my time here. And you're going to hear from Rick a little bit later on, so I'm not going to do that. But it's from To Be Real. He's a beautiful, beautiful, thoughtful, and introspective writer, and you're going to get a sense of that in just a moment.
You can read the quote.
Okay. I'll read the quote. So it's from To Be Real, but it's a little bit long. And he says, when one reflects on how realism is expressed in American painting and sculpture from the late 1960s to the early 1980s, two streams of artistic verisimilitude come immediately to mind. One stream of American realism is an art preoccupied with the human figure, either clothed or nude, that engages the subject in a decidedly cool, distant, and non-emotional manner. I'm thinking about artists such as sculptor Dwayne Hansen or painter Philip Pearlstein, whose mundane shoppers or introspective nude models respectively provide a figural counterpart to that era's enthusiasm for artistic minimalism. The other stream of American realism during that period examines a range of subjects: humanity, the world, the natural world, and industrial civilization through the visual arts, but always in agonizing detail, and usually bereft of any semblance of a social or political context. Painters Chuck Close and Richard Estes are the creators of countless works in this mode of American realism that claims perceptual objectivity in their interrogation of human anatomy and a manufactured world. If one were to push this survey to contemporary times and postmodernist stratagems, then American realism of the last 2 decades of the 20th century would appear to be an agenda-less, unapologetic act, documenting life usually through photography, film, or video, with all its warts, indolence, and voyeuristic aspects. The list of artists who fit this description is long, and as one might suspect, open to all sorts of debates on the intrinsic artistry or social value of such work. End quote. In his Cohen lectures for this week, titled Going There, Considering Black Visual Culture, Dr. Powell will share with us another of his current projects, an art historical treatise on Black visual satire, examining the satirical cartoons, paintings, films, and videos by African American artists. And today, his first lecture is entitled Discompositions, Hazards, and Rags. Without further ado, I give you Richard J. Powell.
Thank you. There was the first time I was on a magazine cover. It was a cartoon drawing of me with a huge afro and machine gun. Now, yeah, it was satire, But if I'm really being honest, it knocked me back a bit. It made me wonder, just how are people seeing me? Ever since I started doing those appropriations, there's been criticism. And I was surprised at the criticism. I thought everybody would get it. So I started doing that in '75 when I painted George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, which is a much more complicated painting than a lot of people think. It's a lot more than a one-liner. We've already come to understand that it's about white perceptions of black people, and they may not be pretty, and they may be stupid. We didn't make up these things, these images. So why should we take the heat? But it's satire, and it's the satire that kills the serpent, you know. In a 1992 review of artist Archibald Motley's first major retrospective exhibition, New York Times art critic Michael Kimmelman acknowledged his struggles with understanding Motley's approach to representing African Americans. It's difficult to get a handle on the art of Archibald J. Motley Jr., Kimmelman began. In the 1920s, this black artist from Chicago devoted himself to painting black life, and he made portraits of family and friends that bestow on their subjects a remarkable, rarefied dignity. How could he also be responsible, Kimmelman continued, for pictures like Lord, My Man's Leavin', with its cartoonish stereotypes of the lazy farmhand snoozing under a tree and the bosomy mammy? Art critics were not alone in their confusion over works like Archibald Motley's Lord, My Man's Leaving. During the 2-year run of Archibald Motley Jazz Age Modernists, an exhibit I curated in 2014 for the National Museum of Art at Duke University and that subsequently traveled to museums in Fort Worth, Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City, I repeatedly responded to exhibition goers about this painting. Visitors who were otherwise enthralled by Motley's adept portraiture, lively genre scenes, sophisticated, colorful compositions, were, like art critic Michael Kimmelman, troubled by the exaggerated black bodies and stereotypic settings in which they were placed. You know, I just love Motley's paintings, is how many people would begin their comments. But this was often followed with, but what about those big red lips on that fat, ugly woman and the nappy hair on that raggedy little black girl? Like centrifugal, double bull's eyes, the woman's lips and the little girl's hair drew viewers deep into Lord, My Man's Leaving bizarre pastoral, where barnyard critters and their human attendants seemingly shared the same lineage. Standing barefoot on the steps of a diminutive wooden hut straight out of a Russian folktale, the woman in this painting, serpentine, pendulous, and exultant, comes across as more chimerical than realistic. A remotely human creature flaying about in a shimmering fungus-covered underworld, and her partners in corporeal outlandishness, a hulking idler in overalls, his recumbent doppelganger in the far distance, and a pickaninny straight out of Uncle Tom's Cabin, embodied the worst racial stereotypes imaginable that, in tandem with the pecking hens, aggressive geese, a lusty dog, a lazy cat, and a backside-revealing knee-knocking mule, all conjured an African-American phantasm of major proportions, an image of rural black life so outrageous and ridiculous as to single-handedly campaign by negative example for the mass migration of self-respecting Southern blacks to the urban North with nary a look backwards. These grotesque figures from the creative mind and skilled hands of an accomplished black artist are either unadulterated stereotypes, the signs of racial self-hatred, or simply inexplicable. But if one considers Archibald Motley's painting in the broader context of African American popular culture, in the introspective years leading up to the 75th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and Motley's professed career-long mission to truthfully represent the Negro people, there might be another more tactical reason for his broad and outlandish characterizations. Rather than limiting his portrayals to a visual version of literary or historical naturalism, Motley deployed narrative-producing strategies of an insubordinate and at times a symbolic character. The anxieties that blacks felt in these years concerning racial discrimination, political disenfranchisement, and social hierarchies were such that for a truth seeker like Motley, painting realistically was only marginally effective in capturing a profound, subcutaneous black reality. Instead, what Motley's paintings executed were complacency-jarring renderings, which through their fictive settings and expressionistic configurations opened floodgates of racial memories, phobias, and fantasies, so visceral and inescapable that upon experiencing them, more authentic concepts of the race could emerge. Motley's rebellious approach cannot be understood without considering it in the context of satire, commonly linked to prose, poetry, or the dramatic arts. The art of satire uses a variety of literary and rhetorical devices to expose the perceived shortcomings or failings of individuals, institutions, or social units. By way of the full spectrum of literary constructs and dramatis personae, a satirist may employ invective, sarcasm, burlesque, irony, mockery, teasing, parody, exaggeration, understatement, or stereotype in a discursive presentation, all to hold his or her intended target up to extreme ridicule and scorn. Although firmly ensconced in literature, satire and its constantly changing, combustible aspects may be expressed more powerfully in visual art. Utilizing caricature and its propensity for visual shorthand, anatomical distortion, narrative hyperbole, and symbolism, artists since antiquity have produced striking, often incisive commentaries on the peoples and events of their times. An ancient Egyptian limestone painting of a cat submissively attending to a seated, corpulent mouse demonstrates that even in New Kingdom Egypt, an artist felt empowered enough to question conventional social hierarchies, albeit through an illustrated animal fable. The late 15th century panel paintings by the Netherlandish artist Hieronymus Bosch, depicting apocryphal scenes of folly, gluttony, and miserliness, are paradigmatic of this artist's mockeries and condemnations of religious heretics and hypocrites via his visual renderings of metaphors and puns. Visual satire's illustrious triumvirate from the early modern period of Western art, England's William Hogarth, Spain's Francisco Goya, and France's Honoré Daumier, placed hard-hitting commentaries about people and politics at the very center of their paintings, giving particular weight to the pretentiousness of elites, greed and corruption within the professional classes, and vanity across the entire social spectrum. The 20th century, with its unconventional warfare, geopolitical realignments, and interminable deliberations from decade to decade on human rights, provoked countless artists to unapologetically satirize perceived enemies, from the anti-war statements of George Grosz and David Smith to the post-Hiroshima expressions of human vulnerability and military madness by sculptors Ed Kienholz and Robert Arneson. Arguably, the preferred medium for visual satirists are the graphic arts, and since the mid-20th century, film and video, in which pictorial criticisms are often accentuated by a memorable title, a wry caption, or a provocative accompanying narration. The roots for this collusion between image and text in visual satire were surely established in the 18th and 19th centuries, when British artists such as William Hogarth, Thomas Rowlandson, and James Gilray both delighted and antagonized audiences with irreverent broadsides and sardonically captioned comics that directed critical barbs and fault-finding charges at all levels of society. Across the channel, French caricaturists Honoré Daumier and Charles Philippon wreaked comparable havoc with their drawings and cartoons of people, largely in the illustrated satirical journal La Charivari. In the United States, and notably in the years immediately following the Civil War and coinciding with the global financial crises of the 1870s, political cartoonist Thomas Nast combined scathing caricatures of politicians and social policies with polemical declarations and combative subheadings, which irrevocably set the template and tenor in American editorial cartoons for more than a century. In the relatively short history of cinema, satirizing warfare, politics, and powerful institutions like the mass media have been very popular, whether the target is a particular figure, as in Nazi Germany's Adolf Hitler and Charles Chaplin's The Great Dictator, and North Korea's Kim Jong-il in Trey Parker's Team America World Police, or governing institutions and political systems, as in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, and Terry Gilliam's Brazil. At the turn of the 21st century, when many filmgoers eagerly embraced satire, director Spike Lee completed Bamboozled, a film that directed its outrage not just towards contemporary mass media and its lowbrow entertainment objectives, but towards racial stereotypes and their insidious circulation throughout American life. Canonical works of Western satire, from the writings of Chaucer, Rabelais, and Molière, to the contemporary efforts of comedian Stephen Colbert, filmmaker Quentin Tarantino, and novelist Paul Beatty, employ discursive strategies that, while in sync with their respective art forms and historical moments, reflect many of the same modalities that also animated the ancients. The devices of the satirists, unflattering portraiture, strange accounts and occurrences, fictional sojourns, startling comparisons and juxtapositions, fables in which animals enact human deeds and word games, rhetorical debates, pertinent aphorisms, and hypercritical orations, all become the vehicles for attack and for bringing to the fore earnest appeals to virtue. The satirical spirit infiltrates virtually all literary forms and discursive practices, and thus it is often difficult to separate this particular impulse and mark its literal boundaries. From the comic to the tragic, satires tug on an au courant audience's understandings and vague moral underpinnings, with an insistence and militancy on par with manifestos or even curses. Indeed, Greek comedy's satirical roots developed in that culture's Dionysian celebrations and ritualistic public exhortations of obscenities and public abuses, which were thought to drive away evil spirits and bring fertility to the community. And this vituperative and Dionysian side of satire, despite philological arguments to the contrary, traces its ancestry, or at least its libidinal disposition, back to the satyr, the half-human, half-goat mythological creature whose physical and social attributes aligned with satire's hybrid qualities and liberatory impulses. As the virulent responses to Archibald Motley's Lord My Man's Leaving demonstrate, the social and psychological impact of visual satire is huge. Being the target of criticism is, of course, embarrassing and painful, but satire's peculiar blend of censure, wit, and ridicule brings an especially caustic quality to the criticism. enough to push the targets of satire towards the metaphorical edge. Political and religious authoritarians have long recognized satire's derisive potential and felt its sting. And at moments of heightened political tensions and social dissent, political cartoonists are frequently among the first victims of the censor. Before delving further into the specifics of how Black visual satire works, it is perhaps useful to first ask, why is Black visual satire a topic worth exploring? Besides Archibald Motley's work initiating this line of inquiry, the work of another African-American artist, Robert Colescott, also prompted me to think about Black visual satire. The Colescott painting I kept circling back to, Pygmalion, intrigued me on several levels. Colescott's unexpected and wicked portrait of the celebrated Irish author George Bernard Shaw. The artist's visual commentaries on great works of art and how narcissism, voyeurism, and metamorphosis inadvertently intersect. It dawned on me that by marshaling a sequence of figural juxtapositions and racial reversals, from the painting's assorted odd couplings to its Black Mona Lisa, and one can assume here a Black Eliza Doolittle, Colescott conveyed the same satirical effects of, say, literary parodies or thematic word games. And that situating Shaw's early 20th century comedy about class transformation and feminine refashioning within an African-American context could, in the postmodern era, reframe this acculturation parable inside a post-Black melodrama with broad, farcical permutations. Another set of images I encountered around the same time also prompted a deeper look into the workings of satire as related to African Americans. Cartoonist Barry Blitz's cover for a 2008 issue of The New Yorker, featuring US President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama appearing as a turban-wearing jihadist and an afro-coiffed 1970s Black radical, brought into wide public scrutiny the never-ending power of cultural and racial stereotypes, as well as the difficulties in differentiating between stereotype and satire. Portraying the Erzak radical president and first lady in the Oval Office of the White House, Blitt took the New Yorker's visual parody to even greater extremes, including in the depicted interior a framed portrait resembling Al-Qaeda's terrorist leader Osama bin Laden and an American flag burning inside the Oval Office's fireplace. The Washington Post's editorial cartoonist Tom Towles immediately recognized the interpretive puzzle posed by Blitz's image. And just days after its publication, Towles created his own inter-referential cartoon that underscored satire's pictorial equivocality and the necessity of a genre-defining, clued-in audience. Towles' cartoon depicted two people in front of a newsstand, looking at the cover of the infamous New Yorker and an identical cover of the eponymous American Racist Monthly magazine, with one of the people declaring, "But one's ironic." And along the cartoon's lower left margin, Towles added two parenthetical mini commentators, one of whom exclaims, "The sophisticated can spot the difference." Blitt and Towles' cartoon colloquy regarding the President and Mrs. Obama wasn't the first time I encountered such cross-conversational, stereotype-laden satires of African Americans in print culture. I immediately thought of the 19th century pictorial repartee between Harper's Weekly's Thomas Nass and the Daily Graphic's Thomas Worth that I came across years ago in the Beinecke Library. In response to Nass's 1874 Harper's Weekly illustration, Colored Rule in a Reconstructed State, a stereotypic picture of buffoonish Black South Carolina state legislators, the Daily Graphic's cartoonist Thomas Worth created two coquets, You Also in Latin, in which an artistic colored gentleman is drawing Thomas Nast with a stick-figured rat's body. I wonder, glibly asked the depicted black artist, how Harper's artist likes to be offensively caricatured himself, while a second seated black man replies, golly, if Harper's picture is nasty, yours is nastier. Apart from the obvious punning on Thomas Nast's name, the representation of a black artist functioning as Thomas Worth's quasi-surrogate introduced in 1874 an especially novel concept, a black satirist hurling the pictorial daggers at a white target. And like Blitt and Tolles' cartoon of almost 130 years later, Worth's pictorial critique of Nast's illustration troubled the certitude of distinguishing stereotype from satire, as well as the idea of an assumed white audience for these nasty pictures. Before embarking on a more fully developed exegesis of black visual satire, it is important to differentiate satire from stereotype. Perhaps the key to this definitional disaggregation can be found in this introduction's second epigraph, which quotes Robert Colescott saying his painting, George Washington Carver, Crossing the Delaware, is a lot more than a one-liner. Colescott's deliberately cartoon-like painting, although populated with every imaginable black stereotypic persona one could conjure, nevertheless incorporated several additional elements, such as a new title for his painting, modified from Emanuel Lewitz's 1851 original, mischievously stenciled onto the canvas in the upper left corner, and a flag-hugging black standard bearer, which in combination with the motley crew of stereotypes pushed the painting into a parodic satirical realm. In Colescott's view, one should not confuse the rather simplistic, one-dimensional denigrations of a rudimentary stereotype with the more complicated, multi-directional attacks of a carefully crafted satire. Revisiting Thomas Nast's colored rule in a reconstructed state, the artist's Republican Party credentials and legendary talent for politically astute caricatures could not lift this particular cartoon beyond a racist and insulting diatribe against African American men, comparable to a literary, highly critical invective. In contrast, Thomas Worth's image, featuring two well-dressed black respondents, one drawing Nast as a hybrid academic portrait bust and crude graffiti-like figure, offered the Daily Graphic's subscribers a layered, largely satirical assault on Harper Weekly's criticism of Reconstruction politics, on Thomas Nast's racist depiction of black men, and against the American press's default white male point of view to which political cartoonists, including Worth on numerous occasions, habitually slanted their work. Instead of putting stereotype on the same level as satire, these previous examples suggest that like parody, irony, burlesque, stereotype is a tool or a mode of expression that a satirist, in combination with other discursive strategies, might use to target an object of criticism. In other words, a satire might include a stereotype, such as Archibald Motley's grotesque group in Lord, My Man's Leaving, and Robert Colescott's offensive crew in George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware. But a stereotype's oversimplified image or idea of a type of person or thing is, by definition, incapable of developing or complicating its critique beyond one overarching ingenious opinion. What a stereotype needs in order to transcend that singular, dead-end path, as evidenced in both Motley and Colescott's multiple perspectives and interpretive entrees, is a calculated placement within the polysemic sprawl and breadth of a deft, penetrating satire. The centrality of black visual satire's cultural and theoretical context, or its frame, is essentially inseparable from the satire itself. In Archibald Motley's Lord, My Man's Leaving, the fanciful black rural world that contains the scene's bizarre cast of characters is key to unraveling Motley's satirical intentions and intimations. The dream world, or the nightmare of a turquoise sky, purple shacks, and acidic yellow terra firma all point to an illusion made even more otherworldly and cerebral by Motley's reiteration on the distant horizon of the departing man, his body either an anecdotal flashback or a premonition lying underneath the cut-off branches of a lavender tree. Not only is Motley's satire situated here in a fictional rural outback, but is also residing in the guffaw-producing, tongue-in-cheek milieu of hokum, the deliberate and playful deployment in urban blues music of African-American vernacular elements and colloquial idioms for oral, comical, and satirical effects. The highly rhythmic, countrified sounds of hokum, along with its sexually suggestive double entendres in its lyrics, found an aesthetic home in Motley's Lord, My Man's Leaving, with its multiple insiders' messages and racial affronts. Again, Motley's likely targets, rural African American underdevelopment and excessive sensitivity concerning class throughout the black community, are contained and visually atomized within this absurdist black frame. This high-stake game in satire, when its content is held hostage by an ostensible subject and implicit meta-narrative, the latter recognizable only to a conversant subset of spectators, is key to its appeal and its dismissal. For knowledgeable observers, including the flesh and blood objects of the satire, the entire affair works on multiple levels, ideally as a brilliant riposte, or as demonstrated in the above epigraph recounting First Lady Michelle Obama's response to her portrayal on the cover of The New Yorker, a misguided assault. What remains constant are the substantial repertory of cultural signs and discourses upon which a black visual satire depends for its meaning, and upon which its audience relies for full membership in this critical enterprise. And yet, what is also frequently at play is a comedic spirit, roguish in nature, which is present especially in satire's more visual manifestations. It would be useful, again, to recount three elements that go into making a black visual satire. These are, one, the black visual satirist, or the black proxy. Two, the object or target of a black visual satire. And three, the audience and cultural context for the black visual satire. A more fully detailed description of each of these follows. The black visual satirist, or the black proxy. Apart from reflexively labeling a satire's creator in its own image, a satire invests the satirist with an intrinsic role in its reception, understanding, and interpretation. Consequently, the biography, the assumed first-person voice, and even the body and physical characteristics of the satirist are not insignificant. Rather, they are paramount in shaping and undergirding the satire's conceptual affect. The satirist's race defines the critique as racially informed, and this descriptor, for better or for worse, stabilizes, at least in cultural terms, a genre that otherwise seems to repudiate constancy and equilibrium. In other words, for a black satire's audience, there is some comfort and an assumed step towards comprehension in knowing that its creator is indeed black. A black satirist moves within a sea of inglorious histories, cultural flashpoints, unspoken self-admissions, and coded eye rolls and grimaces. Not afraid to lash out at life's absurdities, whether that means calling out the powers that be or exposing one's own secret deficiencies. A black satirist wears with pride the mantle of the avenger. Even when the black satirist is actually white, as with the film director Robert Downey and his 1969 countercultural classic Putney Swope. The black proxies and agents of these satirists, the visible black actors, fulfill the racialized prerequisite, giving the black-themed satire an authentic voice and face, and in effect, performing a modern reverse minstrel show that spoke black truth to white power and imbued the satire's diatribes and insults with an added lethal twist of the rhetorical garrote. The object or target of the black visual satire. That racism and its attendant social ills would be the most likely targets of black visual satirists isn't surprising. What is remarkable is the lengthy time frame during which racism has maintained its thematic predominance for artists. From the early 20th century black editorial cartoonists who excoriated white racist politicians and systemic Jim Crow policies, to early 21st century black artists who continued to find apt targets for satire in innumerable social situations and contemporary instances of racial discrimination. Other institutionally sanctioned systems of oppression, along with sexism, religious discrimination, class bias, and other garden variety forms of subjugation, are also fodder for visual satirists who delight in ridiculing the status quo in society and its guardians and apologists. But the relative nature of power means that any governing body or organizing system, no matter how small or historically subjugated itself, is potentially the object of scorn and mockery. And that includes assorted segments of the black community. Indeed, anybody who thinks they are the righteous ones and above criticism in black America will, without warning or a friendly insider's tip, soon discover that they too might become the target, and through satire's toolkit of various devices and tactics, taken down a peg or two. The audience and cultural context for the black visual satire. No satire can truly be called one unless it is collectively recognized as such, and thus it requires a world in which the targeted ridicule and exposed nonsense makes sense. A black satire, like a black satirist, needs a sufficiently knowledgeable, culturally conversant audience who can receive the satire's manifold elements, coded messages, and racially centered criticisms, who can absorb the satire's acrimony without succumbing to the vitriol themselves, and who can bring to culmination, via their deep-seated understanding and viewers' response, the satire's critical transactions. Literary theorist Linda Hutcheon goes a step further, arguing that it is the interpreter that makes irony. Employing Stanley Fish's theories of interpretative communities, Hutcheon reasons that irony is not something intrinsic to a text, but rather something that results from the act of construing, carried out by the interpreter, who works within a context of interpretative assumptions. Irony is always, whatever else it might be, continues Hutcheon, a modality of perceptions, or better, of attribution, of both meaning and evaluative attitude. As artist Robert Colescott acknowledged in this introduction's second epigraph, the realization that the audience and cultural context wasn't entirely in place for seeing the satirical locus of his George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware thwarted the painting's position as an unequivocal satire for many viewers, only carrying that designation for the relative few who could nod and wink with awareness and chuckle at his irreverent, playful merger of the story of American art and wet patriotism, his illustrious examples of racial stereotypes, and an implied Negro history. This knowledge, writes Linda Hutchian, of both the history of art and the racist representations of blacks imposes a special challenge onto Colescott's prospective audience. Given the already limited audience for satire, especially for spectators with adequate degrees of visual and cultural literacy in the world, it is a high bar for viewers to also have the racial competencies to meet black visual satire and its conceptual challenges halfway. For my next two lectures, I want to consider two case studies of black visual satire. These lectures will examine satires created in the 1960s through the 1980s by an array of artists whose visual assaults deliberately made use of stereotypes and racist performance practices such as blackface minstrelsy. And two, the late 20th and early 21st century artist Robert Colescott and his madhouse worlds of interracial couplings, cultural ironies, and social exposés. A discussion of Colescott's paintings will not just be confined to this third lecture. Rather, his paintings will intermittently surface throughout the course of these three lectures, providing counterpoints to the other black visual satires and bringing added signification and conceptual weight to the various strains of racial offenses in modern and contemporary art. Interracial relations between the sexes, one of Robert Colescott's constantly revisited themes, receive a retrofitted treatment in turn of the 21st century works by several African-American satirists. Unlike Colescott's pioneering generation of racial sexual outlaws, artists of a younger cohort, such as Carol Walker, Renee Cox, and Beverly McKeever, used the interracial sexual scenario as a conduit into postmodern uncertainties surrounding identity, dominance, and submissiveness, and the parallel notion of a selective myopia or outright blindness between the races and sexes. Art historian Derek Conrad Murray, writing about the ideological differences between Betty Saar's and Carol Walker's respective works, rightly states that the distinction between the two approaches rests on the fault line between an externalized critique of white racism and an internalized and decidedly more Foucaultian exploration of power and its abuses. The latter, a critical concern of other black visual satirists of Walker's generation, like Renee Cox, also, artists such as that also interrogate that kind of approach in their own work. For example, Beverly McKeever's Invisible Me, rather than emphasizing the long-held social taboo of interracial sex, or simply targeting the bigotry and hypocrisy around interracial unions, as Colescott often did, attacks a deep-seated, universally shared psychology of racial and sexual imperceptibility, represented here vis-a-vis expressive brushstrokes, plotted erasures, and blackface anonymity. This particular theme, as well as other critical refrains in the satirical paintings of artist Robert Colescott, will be examined in greater depth in my third lecture, which I now entitle Robert Colescott, Between the Heroic and the Ironic. Much of the confusion surrounding black visual satire often stems from the strategic appropriation and redeployment of stereotypic imagery by modern and contemporary black artists. As products of a post-1960s cultural re-education in the United States that looks unfavorably upon racist imagery and categorically dismisses it, contemporary audiences are largely unprepared to accept this pernicious material as having any social or aesthetic value, even in the new context of art. So the confidence many satirists have had in audiences being able to see how stereotypic imagery can be used in sophisticated, satirical ways has been clearly misplaced. And yet, the artists of the Black Arts Movement and their successors, including Robert Colescott, readily adopted Aunt Jemima, Uncle Tom, watermelons, disembodied toothy grins, and other stereotypic Black characters and insignia, seeing in this material a vehicle for making a burlesque of racism and for interjecting into post-civil rights discourse an antithetical, irony-creating element. Also paradigmatic of this satirizing impulse, and also part of my second lecture, tomorrow's lecture, The Minstrel Stain, is the African-American reinvention of blackface minstrelsy, which rather than blacking up white people for racist performances, frequently put white pigment on black faces for highly ritualized counterattacks. These stylized white-face presentations in art, from Jean Genet's The Blacks, A Clown Show, to David Hammond's How You Like Me Now, were contingent upon audiences having some familiarity with blackface and envisioning the possibility of a Black satirical usurping and revamping of this controversial tradition in American theater. When a critic decides to satirize someone or something, the idea of taking one's particular skills for wit and reprimand and one's fearlessness in leveling contempt and ridicule to an extraordinary, almost unfathomable point of execution is called going there. This euphemism suggests a trek of sorts, advancing towards a target and its expansive ruination, figuratively speaking. And it hopefully doesn't take too long or too much deciphering for that critic's audience or community to realize that what has just transpired. A figural pathway or a gauntlet through insinuation, through analogies, through comparisons, through exaggerations, and through subtleties to bring into the light of day the offenses and failures of a particular antagonist or collective concern. The quotation surrounding there, in going there, isn't casually or melodramatically consigned. It suggests the distinctiveness of and the articulated emphasis on a conceptual climax, the ultimate denunciation in which the satirist fully and devastatingly converges on the vices and follies of her or his target. Think of there as the akimbo arms and hands that perch on the hips of a paradigmatic, attitude-consumed Black woman, a corporeal accent on an already blistering, dead-on judgment. And given the exigencies that Black women have shouldered in a culture that has historically devalued their personhoods and dismissed their humanity, they have become, ironically, the embodiments in popular U.S. culture of a censorious, satire-spewing chorus, the Cassandras of the internet era and eternity, who intimately know the crossbows and projectiles of deprecation and therefore use the power of going there with a heightened sense of its critical force against justified targets of ridicule and with an awareness about the accompanying psychological reverberations of such critiques. Archibald Motley and Robert Colescott painted Lord My Man's Leaving and George Washington crossing the Delaware, not with just the noble objectives of demonstrating fine art competency or even making critical splashes in the art world. What drove them to paint Black madness and a world conceived in absurdity was a sense of outrage over their respective moments of too much complacency and too little transparency. And add to this the indignation of a wicked, devilish streak that stirred Motley and Colescott into taking African American art to an uncharted yet exciting place, a remote, faraway location, light years removed from the dignified products of a Laura Wheeler Waring or a Charles White, where racial stereotypes, rather than being ignored or vociferously condemned, are made manifest in all of their grotesque visibility, but also tactically used, like vinegar cider on collards. And when these artists dared to visually enter into this no man's land of attacking the race or ridiculing the idea of a separate American history or Negro nobility, they were in essence going there, into, like many other cultural critics before them, most notably in the literary and performing arts, but also in the visual arts. Searching for Black visual satire has opened up a virtual exhibition hall to me. And in tandem with this house of unforgivable truths, an adjacent chapel of artistic inroads and maneuvers. Retaliatory acts against the sins of the world, both mortal and venal, but not without laughter, as the poet Langston Hughes once said, nor without a sly but firm poke in the ribcage. The following passage about the renowned African-American artist Henry Ossawa Tanner, taken from the alternative, unexpurgated history of the image of the Black in Western art, illustrates just one of those elbow jabs. Le 1er janvier 1895, 51 Boulevard Saint-Jacques, Paris, France, dearest Bishop and Father, my sincerest apologies for the fortnight delay in writing. That uncharacteristic spell of indolence, along with our Lord's birthday, put me even further behind in my correspondence. I hope Mother and everyone else is fine and in good health, especially my sweet little Bertha. I forgot to mention in my last letter that upon my return last October, I spent a few days in London, where I ran into some folks from home, members of a minstrel troupe who were performing at St. James Hall. One of them, Mr. Bob Haight, took a real interest in the banjo lesson, which he saw in my picture album and said reminds me of the good old days in Georgia. I must confess, it was not until last night, while, dare I say it, welcoming in the new year at the Moulin Rouge, that I realized how much I hate that painting. I know, Bishop, everyone in America who has seen that painting loves it. The colored people and many white brethren. Mr. Ogden generously bought it and has kindly given it to the Hampton Institute. Even Mr. Booker T. Washington, the wizard, has praised the banjo lesson, urging me to continue painting the colored race, our people. He suggested that I should next paint the quilting lesson, and after that, the cotton picking lesson. Enough already. Sitting with my fellow artists, French and American, in the Moulin Rouge last night, enjoying fraternité, vin rouge, les femmes, chansons, made me realize why I left America and have turned my back on being America's Negro painter. The freedom of the can-can might resemble the cakewalk, but the similarity ends when the dancers leave the stage and return to the real world. The banjo lesson, like the cakewalk, is America. And for all of its heart and soul, it reminds me of Mr. Haight of Georgia. And I am as far away from that as the Seine is from the Schuylkill. Well, not exactly. While walking from my living quarters to my studio on Rue de Seine, I will intermittently catch that unmistakable, disgusting American epithet for colored people, barked at me by a haughty, bursting at the seams touriste américain, amazed at the sight of someone like me, full of myself and free within myself. Were it not for my fellow flaneur, the American artist Herman Murphy, an enlightened Massachusettsian, on many of those occasions I would have lost my head and pummeled some unfortunate braggadocio. Instead, Murphy pulls me away from these Grover Cleveland patriots, and we occupy ourselves with chatter about anarchists and the latest vernissage before arriving at our respective studios. Bishop, I know you must think in hearing these words from your eldest son that I have lost my mind in Paris, that I no longer sound like a colored gentleman who knows the Lord and the ways of our world and consequently behaves for the sake of salvation and survival. I know my talk of cabarets, vin rouge, les femmes, chansons, and pummeling ignorant white men might unsettle you and cause you to wonder if you have lost me. And my reply to this is that it is not the shepherd that has lost one of his flock, but rather that this lamb has found himself. And that the old world, with its cultural treasures, maturity in regards to la vie, and distance from American prejudice, offers unspeakable joys and defeats that for all of your wisdom and years in faith, Father, you cannot begin to fathom. Bishop, I have not abandoned the faith, but I must repeat the words of the Catholics who say in their confessional booths, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Last night, I sinned and drank what they call the green fairy. The concoction is the color of a medicine bottle, and it is all the rage here. All I had was one glassful, but minutes after finishing the green poison, the cabaret looked like a carnival funhouse, and my friends were all hazy with no clear likenesses. But God works in wondrous ways. And while under the fairy's spell and looking at the entertainment by Foutit and Chocolat, a white and Negro clown team of contortionists, I saw in my mind's eye the banjo lesson. But instead of the old man and boy, it was you and I. You were teaching me Ernest Hogan's All Coons Look Alike to Me, and I could not get the rhythm right. Then you changed the tune and tried teaching me Reverend Charles Wesley's Whither Should I Go? And I could not get that right either. I jumped off your knee and ran through the cabin door. It was a sign, Bishop. A sign given to me by the devil. But it was God's divine plan for the devil to offer me the green venom in the Moulin Rouge and to finally see what I had always felt. I am pleased Mr. Ogden donated the banjo lesson to Hampton. But if that painting never leaves Hampton's picturesque, ivy-covered campus, and if I never see it again in my lifetime, it will not cause any hang-wringing on my part. The banjo lesson is the shackle and chain that stretches across the Atlantic and drags me back to an Academy of Art Coon show. The Moulin Rouge is the muse of Paris, revealing her charms to a virgin youth and offering him the world and membership in a church that has no color line. Give my love to Mother and the children. With affection, H.O.T., Paris, France. My feeble attempt here to adopt the irreverent tone and droll schematizing of a satirist is admittedly in the junior varsity class, but the exercise nonetheless revealed the communicative reach and socio-political risk that a black satirist, whether literary or visual, takes on, in effect, to go there. Into the dawning, thankless realms of reprobation, sarcasm, and candor. As the R&B singer-songwriter R. Kelly prophetically announced in his outrageous hip-hop opera satire, Trapped in the Closet, the doors of the church is open. Thank you. Q&A? Q&A? Questions, comments?
Oh, yeah. Wow, Rick, that's great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Is this thing on? Oh, now it's on. Yeah, this is going to be fabulous lecture. It's a brilliant lecture.
Thank you.
Marvelous. I have two questions. One, how do you read Lord My Man's Leaving against, obviously, Jacob Lawrence, the Migration series, right? Because it's obvious. It seems to me it's signifying on that. That's the first question. And secondly, I think the fist bump, New Yorker cover, is one of the funniest things I ever saw. I have it framed in my office. I asked Barack Obama himself in the Oval Office what he thought about it. He said he hated it. I told him I liked it. I thought it was funny. And but you know, because satire is in the eye of the beholder. That's just you know, it just. Some things are funny to some people, and they aren't. So how do you talk about the Migration series and Lord My Man's Leaving first, and then in terms of the New Yorker cover?
It's funny, Skip, you should mention Jacob Lawrence in the context of Motley, because I'll never forget, we had a big event, Duke had a big event at the Whitney Museum while the exhibit was up. And I remember somebody walked up to me, and this was an aspiring collector, an African-American collector. And he was disturbed by Archibald Motley's work. And what he said, which was really fascinating, was, I'm looking at this, but I'm also thinking about having gone to the Museum of Modern Art. And I've seen the Migration series. And that experience was so uplifting. That experience was so wonderful. That experience was so marvelous. And he wanted me to reconcile that these two works of art, bodies of work, could have coexisted in 1940, 1941. And I don't know if he heard me, but what I tried to explain to him is that Jacob Lawrence, the Migration series, it's a wonderful, very important, significant work of art. But that's one of our stories. And that if we go back to the 1940s, the early 1940s, we are in an incredibly fraught moment of starting a world war, not us starting a world war, but a world war being started that we are being pulled into, and we're trying to figure out, can we be a part of this, or can we not be a part of this? And Archibald Motley, with that painting, I think is really kind of touching something really visceral and inside people, which speaks to frustration, anger, and hilarity all at the same time. I'm a big cinema buff, and so whenever Cabin in the Sky comes on, Vincent Minnelli's film with Lena Horne and Eddie Anderson.
I keep it on my iPad.
Okay.
I do. It's one of the canonical, along with Green
If you
Pasture.
look at that film, it's kind of, it's another version of Lord, My Man's Leaving, where it's very much a self-conscious kind of critique of urban-rural. I mean, you have all of these kind of major Hollywood personalities, Lena Horne and Eddie Anderson and Ethel Waters, who were Broadway stars kind of playing this kind of folkloric, idyllic narrative about the tug between good and evil. And of course, everybody, when you get to that nightclub, you say, I want evil. I want to get in that club and dance to Duke Ellington.
Right.
And so, I don't know if this is a good answer for you, but it's that these works coexist at a particular moment in the Black experience, and they both are valid for the kinds of issues that they both present, but also the issues that they force us to come to terms with.
But that kind of simultaneity is continuous in the Black tradition. It's always poked fun at itself. Yeah. And every tradition has. Yeah. I mean, what I like about that image is that it's 1940. Yeah. And so it's a great way to teach. Yeah. Call and response, or signifying, or the way that parody works, or also the complexity of Black people. That there's never been only when now Larry Bobo and I teach Intro to Afro, and Evelyn and I used to teach it. And Evelyn, of course, is the theorist of the politics of respectability. So I did lectures. My lectures are called The Politics of Disrespect. And simultaneous with the Harlem Renaissance is signifying and playing the dozens and Shine the Titanic. It's always been Saturday night, Sunday morning in the Black tradition.
And the truth that will be filtered through that playful repartee.
Right.
What was your second question?
I think it's funny as hell, that cover.
Oh, okay,
I think it's funny as hell.
Michelle probably didn't like it.
No, Brock didn't like it. But Bobo didn't like it. That means it's really funny. So what? I mean, you can't kick me out of the race because I liked it. You know what I mean? That's the nature of parody and satire. Some people like it, some people don't. It's not like one is good and the cartoonist should have jumped off the Empire State Building. Though the David Remnick was very embarrassed. They all apologized a million times. But I think it's funny as hell.
And the image that I showed you from that moment during the campaign where they actually do the fist bump shows you that the artist saw that image and took from that image the basic outlines and form of that moment and just kind of flipped it into this ultra, kind of representation within the White House itself.
Right, but as you say, satire is in the eye of the beholder. To me, it is parodying all the racists who look at them and see them as Black version of Osama. You see what I mean? Not that they are. That's the nature of parody. That's the nature of satire.
And I love how Tom Towles in the Washington Post immediately saw all of the confusion, the delightful confusion that this image might generate.
Right.
Yes, thank you.
Questions, comments?
Hi, Rick.
Hey.
That was
Someone
really
passing
terrific.
around the microphone?
I have the mic. And I want to add further the conversation between you and Skip that occurred to me in the course of your wonderful talk, which is to say, are there other ways of thinking through signifying from the vantage point of parody and the point in which, for some people, of course, it's satire, and for other, it's disparagement, and not necessarily across the color line, but as in this particular cartoon and other examples, within the Black community, within the white community, how much of this is readership, we as viewers identifying in different ways, how much of this is in the voice, so to speak, of the artist, and through this whole broad sweep of context, are there ways of sort of rethinking even the notion of signifying in new ways visually within these forms?
Well, thank you for that question, Suzanne. One of the things that I tried to walk through in a very kind of elementary way, but something I'm going to get back to, again, is this issue of audience and this issue of a certain kind of literacy and ability of an audience to get it. And this is always the risk. This is always the challenge. And that's why I find these artists so brave, because they know as they are moving into these directions that there is a core group who will click, who will find some sense of connection to that. But they also have a sense that they're going to lose some people along the way. But that doesn't stop them. I think they plug ahead. And so this is to me, a very exciting and fascinating moment in any kind of artistic episode where an artist decides to make that statement and at the same time is willing to make that statement knowing that they may leave some behind, but also perhaps knowing or hoping or anticipating that they'll eventually get it. And I'm thinking about growing up on the south side of Chicago, and being a part of repartee with family and friends, and the jokes being kind of spewed out, and people get it at this level, and then people get it at this level, some people don't get it at all. But one would argue, one would hope that those are not just kind of moments of art and expression, but those are also learning moments. Those are moments of kind of developing one's literacy, cultural chops, to be able to kind of figure out, what the critique is, where the target is, how one is imbricated in that. And so this is how culture grows and how culture evolves. But it's not one that is for the total innocence, for someone who's not willing to really be an engaged member of the audience. Pat.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And there were some things that were really mind-blowing, especially at the end when you're talking about Henry Tanner. I mean, that is wonderful. I mean, who would know that he would have that kind of sensibility in the relationship with his father, that he could talk like that, I mean, that's great. It gives a lot of extra layers, But I want to get back to the Thomas Nast.
Yes.
And I want to thank you also for showing the Thomas Worth. I mean, that is also wonderful. I wish that I had known it before. I have spent a lot of time looking at that image by Nast. And I've looked at the image. I usually give it to my students on final exams. But the image is very complicated because, and what really, I was crushed when I was reading Eric Foner's Reconstruction, his book. And he uses that as an illustration about how racist Thomas Nast is. Well, the thing is that the image is racist when we look at it today. But I think that the image is a miscalculation and a kind of ignorance on the part of the editors. If you look at the text that goes along with it, is that the text is describing a typical session of the South Carolina legislature. And this is copied verbatim by Harper's Weekly from a South Carolina newspaper. And of course, the South Carolina newspaper is going to put these African American legislators in the worst possible light. And the miscalculation is that the Harper's editors are not at all skeptical about the point of view of the South Carolina newspaper. I mean, do you follow me? It's kind of complicated, but so I think that's a miscalculation. And so I think, well, why does Nass do this? Because there are so many instances in which he has these wonderful, if you want to say sympathetic, and quote the humanity of Africans. I mean, they're wonderful pictures that he does, but I came to the conclusion that Harper's Weekly, which was a Republican, it was on the side of the radical Republicans, and it kind of moved along the way the Republicans morphed into the party of big business, which we have now. And what Nast is opposed is ignorance. That's why he does all these worst caricatures of the Irish.
Yeah, that's true.
He doesn't like people who are stupid. He thinks they ought to follow white middle class standards of decorum, without even looking at the fact that these South Carolina legislatures, when you're reading the text from Harper's even, they are signifying to each other. They're talking about peanuts, and they are talking in code that none of the white people understand. It's a different cognitive style, that it was beyond the comprehension of Nast or the Republican, editors of Harper's to even comprehend. But, you see what I mean?
Yeah.
There's just these different levels so that it's...
And I'm channeling Karen Dalton, who's done incredible work on Thomas Worth and the Blackville series.
Yes.
And so this is our artist who does the Daily Graphic one, which is
that is
in that
amazing.
case, it's incredibly celebratory of this new phenomena, the black satirist. But he's also known as one of the most virulent racist cartoonists
That's right.
of the Currier and Ives period in the 80s and on.
Darktown.
So an artist can take on or adopt or impose a
Right.
position that can move and morph rather, depending on context and instances. Yes.
Where is that image of the black parody? I love that. The unexpected, the image of the black Western art.
I did it.
You did that? Good, I want it. That's my birthday and Christmas present. Did you make it into a work of art?
Yeah, that's
Great. Well, where is it?
on my desk at home.
Well, send it up here. Because that confirms I've been arguing with David Byman. I want to do a sequel on Sambo art. And I'm probably going to have to do it by myself because David is embarrassed. He finds that very embarrassing and people call him a racist. But I think that doing for every one noble image of a black person, there must be 10,000 racist images, right?
Yeah.
And I think it would be important to codify that. But what do you think? You think it's a good idea?
Well,
since you did that racist parody of the cover.
I did. My text was actually taken from a Red Fox record from the 1950s. These were these adult records.
Well, I love them. You
would
kidding?
Be played in black homes.
I gave a lecture this morning quoting Red Fox at the Broad Institute.
And when they advertised these records, they would say racy and you'll love this. And so what I was doing was looking at that and saying, okay, I'm going to write this on my unexpurgated copy of the image of the black.
Right. You used to have to order them through Jet and Ebony, and they came wrapped in brown paper.
Yeah.
Remember?
Yeah.
Remember the horse race? Oh, anyway, we can talk about that at dinner. This is fabulous. Cheryl, the Cohen fellow. Did you introduce yourself as the Cohen fellow?
I did, and I just introduced myself as myself.
Oh. Okay.
I'm the Cohen fellow. So I think my question follows up a little bit on what you're saying, Skip, and the last question. So I'm really interested in knowing if you're going to include some sort of art historical or historical examples of arguments in the art world. And I'm thinking of a conference that took place here that Karen Dalton will be very familiar with in 97 or 98, which was called Change the Joke. Slip the Yoke. It's a quote, obviously, after Ralph Ellison, where you had this controversy that was brewing in 1997 after Kara Walker was the first, not the youngest person to receive the MacArthur Award. And there was, and I remember this having received one in the gallery where I worked, a fax as part of this fax a letter chain that came from Betty Saar trying to get people to dispute her winning this award. And this conference, which took place over 2 days, included a number of other artists who make imagery like Michael Ray Charles and Glenn Ligon and so on to kind of debate this issue. And I wanted to know if this is going to be something that you're thinking about, because it was a pretty heated exchange over a period of 2 days. And at the very same time, I think that Kara had an installation here at the Carpenter Center as well.
Yeah. I'm actually going to talk about Kara Walker tomorrow. While the focus of tomorrow's talk is the 60s and the 70s and the Black Arts Movement, it's framed within the context of how the stereotype is flipped.
Right.
And I'll be parking with Kara primarily on Sugar Baby, a work that she just created in Brooklyn 2 years ago. But I will try to frame her in a larger, kind of format. No, that was a really important event that was organized here at Harvard.
Yeah.
And it's really taken me a while to try to think deeply about Kara Walker and the implications of Kara. And I really see this opportunity to do these lectures and to think deeply about this topic as a wonderful opportunity to really kind of revisit her, which again I'll do a little bit tomorrow. But when I do this in the book form, I certainly want to flesh that out. So thank you for that suggestion.
And maybe you can get a copy of some of those emails, or not emails, they were faxes from Betty.
Yeah.
It was mean and nasty. One of the most unfortunate episodes in the history of black aesthetics, as far as I'm concerned. Censorship is to art as lynching is to justice. Any other questions, comments? A last one?
Oh, yay, excellent. I am really happy to be at this talk. Thank you so much. My name is Giovanna Jones. I'm an incoming grad in AAAS.
Okay.
And I've been thinking a lot about memes in internet culture.
Yes.
And that space is satire, particularly allowing for a different audience to be centered on a mass stage. So I think about with The New Yorker, with any kind of publications, there's a sense of, not that black folks haven't always been, playing the dozens and participating in satire, but that the mass stage wasn't censoring black folk as the audience for the mass conversation of what's the joke and what's not, and kind of like what's the discursive practice that gets to take shape on the main stage. So that said, I'm wondering in your work if you're going to engage Twitter, like if you're going to engage Black Twitter, memes, any of that, because it's funny. It's funny, and I have a lot of, I think there's one meme that someone showed in one of my classes last semester, and it was really messed up. But it was a meme of Stevie Wonder, and the caption said, "Black men be like, I see my kids every week." And it's something where, and it's really messed up, but it's something where for folks who weren't quote unquote in on the joke, primarily folks that weren't black, you had to contend with acknowledging or believing a stereotype in order to then see whether or not you could participate in the joke. Whereas the rest of the class was already at the next step of kind of like grappling with it, laughing, but then getting to the next point of like, okay, well, let's really talk about this. So yeah, I think Twitter has become an interesting space for that, so I'm wondering if you're going to engage any of that.
I'm so glad you brought up memes. In a earlier and bigger version of what I just presented to you today, I try to address a meme. Or memes as a. Do you all know what a meme is? It's online. It's usually a very short kind of phrase or a set of phrases. It's layered onto an image, and the idea is that visceral combination of that image and that line, encapsulates, the kind of the critique, the interrogation, the attack, the target. One of the challenges I have with thinking about it in the context of this, and it's not a challenge, it's just a reality of life in the late 20th, early 21st century, now well into the 21st century, is that there was a moment, we were talking earlier about Red Fox and the kind of insular black community where our jokes were kind of traded back and forth amongst ourselves in our nightclubs, in our theaters, in our barbershops. That was a very kind of confined, insular world. And the world of the meme is the universe. And that's and therefore it's a universe that again has an audience that might be into the joke or might be able to dissect or take apart the innuendo or not. And that's what's so kind of fascinating about black visual satire in the 21st century, that it automatically almost invariably has this much wider, larger audience. Cole Scott, who I'll talk about on Thursday, is a fascinating figure in the sense that this is an artist who comes out of New Orleans, a black New Orleans community in Oakland, California. But by the time he becomes an important, significant artist, his visual jokes are being shown on the Lower East Side, in major art museums, and at the Venice Biennale. So what does one do with this kind of shift, this ability? And one could say the same thing has happened in mass media, where black entertainers at one point operated in a very narrow world, and now that world is global. Many people would argue that these literacies are not that translatable. That one really needs a grounding in some of our tradition to kind of understand the nuances. But this is something to kind of process. So thank you for bringing that up. It's something that I have thought about. Yeah.
But Rick, the problem with what you just said, though, is, I mean, your whole lecture, the part of it is that there's been difference within difference. Mm-hmm. Not all black people read these images in the same way. It's
true.
So it's not as simple as a black discursive or interpretive community and a white one. Yeah. There were black people. Look, Larry and I have disagreed about that cover. And the history of black aesthetics is about disagreements, too. So it's more complicated than black or white.
Yeah.
I don't know what the right terms would be. It's just some people see parody and think it's funny, and some people see it literal. Well, it's the literal and the figurative, which I write about in The Signifying Monkey, right? Anyway, let's give it up for Rick Powell for brilliant first lecture. My God, that was great.